you're from Hapag-Lloyd. It's one of the biggest container shipping companies in the world. You must think a lot about clean fuels, alternative technologies, and actually, what is the marine fuel mix going to be to get you where you need to go? Can you just explain a little bit about the way you're thinking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we are world's fifth largest container shipping company, and we have the net zero carbon target by 2045, and we consume around 4.5 million tons of fossil fuels every year. So it's contributing significantly into greenhouse gas emissions. But we see it as a challenge, and we are also doing some measures to reduce our CO2 footprint. And in terms of the fuel mix you asked, so we are already consuming drop-in biofuels, and we are one of the largest consumers of drop-in biofuels. And the contribution of these drop-in biofuels to our overall fuel consumption is not that big, but still we are the biggest in consumption. And the way we are doing it is also that we are commercializing our consumption of the biofuels by selling Ship Green through our Ship Green containers. But I think going forward, the drop-in biofuels, especially made from waste products, will not be enough, because if you look at the overall picture, like there is 40 million tons of biodiesel production capacity across the globe, out of which only 10 million tons of production capacity can consume used cooking oil or waste residual material as a feedstock. And the product which comes out of these plants, which can go into maritime sector, which is like bottom of the barrel of these biodiesel plants, is only 500,000 tons. And overall, if you look at the maritime sector demand, it's more than 250 million tons. So we don't see that waste, residue-based biofuels will be a long-term solution. So we need to find alternative pathways. So that's why we have also ordered 13 LNG vessels. So by first quarter of 2025, we will have 13 fossil LNG vessels, which our ambition is to decarbonize by consuming bio-LNG, like liquefied biomethane. And then, of course, it's diversification from, let's say, oil-based, vegetable oil-based or residual oil-based feedstocks towards food waste and residual biomass. And that, of course, will help us then switching from drop-in biofuels to bio-LNG for these vessels. But in the end, this, both bio-LNG and drop-in biofuels, they are unscalable because of the technology constraints. And we are also working with the technology developers who are trying to develop the technologies to scale up production of drop-in biofuels from biomass to liquid-based production technologies, and also from biomass to biomethane production technologies. But of course, that's a work in progress. So we need to see, okay, what solution we have today, or what scalable solution we have today. And that scalable solution is methanol. And there we are conducting study with Seaspan to evaluate retrofit of some of our existing vessels for dual fuel methanol. And as you know, like in case of methanol, we of course need biogenic CO2, but via biomass gasification or point source CO2 capture technologies are more or less mature, and they can be deployed to make biomethanol, and also in combination with electrolysis hydrogen, you can produce hybrid bio and e-methanol products.
Yep.
And that can solve the decarbonization challenge for maritime sector to a certain extent. But then, of course, we need to see, okay, what is the long-term, most scalable solution? And there ammonia comes. But as you know, there are safety issues with ammonia. So overall, I mean, for us, for maritime sector, our life is getting more complex, because before we were only dealing with fossil fuel oil, VLSFO or ULSFO, and the supply chain was pretty much understandable. But now it's more, let's say, complex situation for this multi-fuel scenario. But it also gives, let's say, good commercial opportunities for us if we make smart decisions around this.
Yeah, it's really hard to actually be sitting here as your directors and your exec team trying to make those choices. It must be very challenging, because there's so many different pathways.
Yeah.
But talking of pathways, Alexi, you know, your company made headlines about using sails, so back to the future, using wind again to actually start your decarbonisation path. What do you see when you think about decarbonisation of shipping and your business more generally?
So Cargill is not primarily an energy company, but we have a big impact on energy markets, on decarbonization, because we are a big consumer of energy through the shipping. We are one of the biggest dry bulk ship owners and charterers. And we have recently, made the headlines thanks to the wings we have installed of some of our big carriers. We have also made a lot of efforts in all the plants we own across the world, moving, especially in Europe, a lot of our boilers from gas into biomass boilers, using the waste we have in our agricultural supply chain. So, for example, in Amsterdam, we have a crush plant that we have moved from burning gas to burning cocoa shells coming from our cocoa business. The gas crisis of 2022 and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas moving to the roof have accelerated our transition in Europe towards low carbon and low carbon energy and more resilient plants. We are also a big producer of bioenergy, so we play in what this gentleman from Bloomberg called 6% in 2050, right? In this the whole ranking of renewable energy. So we are not going to play in electricity. It's not our game, even if this is the trend of the century. I know, but this is not where we can bring something. We play in the bioenergy sphere, and as a big producer of biodiesel, bioethanol, and hopefully soon, we just started biogas. We believe in it. We started biofuels as an extension of what we were already doing for agriculture, for food, right? For example, biodiesel, while we were crushing rapeseed to do rapeseed oil, we did biodiesel from rapeseed oil. But more and more, we are transitioning into a second generation of biofuels under the drive of, especially of the EU legislation, regulation, which we welcome, and we do recycling of waste into energy. So we have a plant in Belgium that is producing biodiesel from waste, greases, and lipids, and we have the privilege to count amongst our customers Hapag-Lloyd. So we sell to road shipping industry, but we also have recently invested into biogas from waste in the south of the Netherlands. And we do that because we think we have an edge into the feedstock. So the gentleman from Bloomberg rightly said that feedstock is going to be an issue for bioenergy. I completely agree. We think that as Cargill, because we are big in agriculture, close to the farmer, to the farm waste, to the food waste, we have an edge into this problem. We can bring a solution. This is why we invest into biogas. And to finish, of course, where we play most is not the fuels, it's agriculture. It's a big source of emissions. So transport is around 25 to 30% of emissions. Agriculture is 10 to 15, depending on whether you count the diesel from the tractors or not. So this is also where we try to bring solutions to decarbonization, but it brings us already beyond fuel. So,
as we know, agriculture is one of the really hard to abate sectors.
Absolutely.
So, it's really interesting that you're starting to get into the circular economy there. But let's move on to Corinne, because the biogas reference is a really interesting one for you. And when you think about Total Energies, your targets of 40% reduction between 2015 and 2030 are quite amazing. The other thing you've done more recently that everyone's watching is you've got your refineries and you've actually called for one of the biggest tenders ever for green hydrogen. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then also what Total Energies is doing to meet those, meet those targets in the clean fuel space?
Well, we are an energy player in the market today. So the question that you're asking really relates to how we want to use our existing assets and our existing refineries in Europe in particular. And we want to use them in two ways. We want first to transition them, to decarbonize them, and we want to use them as a base to develop new business, and particularly low-carbon business on our existing sites. We have the possibility to convert our existing refineries, and that's why this market is very interesting for us, or to co-process already biomass into those refineries. For us, it's a big and growing market, driven by the European regulation and the incorporation mandate of 6% in the aviation industry. We anticipate to be able to produce 1.5 million tons of SAF by 2030 out of a market of roughly 20. We are partnering with Airbus also to develop 100% renewable sustainable aviation fuel. We've announced that this past week. But indeed, for SAF, one of the key challenges is indeed the limitation that you can have on feedstocks. And in some occasions in France, we've put together joint ventures with animal fat producers in order to ensure the feedstock to our refineries. So we already converted 2 out of our 7 refineries in Europe. So the one we have in La Mède in the south of France, and that was back in 2019 already. And also, we're doing the conversion in Grandpuits, another refinery in France. It's going to start in 2025. We're also developing new technologies based on ethanol to jet in order to address the limitation on fuels. Now, to talk about the second product, and you mentioned the tender, so let's talk about hydrogen. So the same philosophy here. We want to decarbonize our refineries, and today our network in Europe is generating 5 million tons per year of CO2, Scope 1 and Scope 2, mostly because it relies on grey hydrogen. So we want to move towards green hydrogen because the European regulation really drives towards that, in particular the RFNBO regulation, renewable fuel of non-biological origin. We are doing it in 2 ways. So we develop our own production assets, like we are doing in La Mède with a 100 megawatt electrolyzer. But we're also signing some supply contracts, and we did that in Germany this past year. We've launched this tender, indeed, for 500,000 tons per year of hydrogen, green hydrogen, that we need by 2030. We're, I think, one of the first industrial companies to issue such a tender. And by doing so, we know we also help structure the market. We can do this because the regulation in Europe are giving us an economic space and gives us incentives in order to pay for the higher cost of hydrogen. And we're going to see what the results is going to be. Maybe one last point on our assets, which I find very interesting. Those regulations, and we saw earlier in the presentation, are also driving the electrification of land transportation in a massive way. Things are starting to pick up, and we start seeing that in terms of fuel revenues that we expect will decline in the coming years. And even if the market is going to electrify, we know that customers will charge mostly at home and not necessarily on our retail stations. So this has an impact on our network of stations, and we've made the decision to actually divest part of this network. And earlier this year, we announced the sale of our German retail station and in the Netherlands to Alimentation Couche-Tard, which is a Canadian retail marketer. At the same time, we're investing massively into electric mobility. We operate already 50,000 charging points, and we keep investing 2 billion in the next years, mostly on big cities in Europe and on highways.
You're a bit of a hybrid in many ways, because you are an airline, but you're also a supplier at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and you are a leader in sustainable aviation fuel. So tell us about what you're thinking, and tell me how nervous you are about these 2 guys using all your feedstock.
Thank you. I think the feedstock challenge definitely is a challenge. We definitely see multiple trajectories, technology pathways getting to SAF, and the one which is available now has a feedstock potentially a feedstock limit, although also there we see technologies moving, which actually might produce extra feedstock and might make extra feedstock available to that current HEFA pathway. Maybe first our own ambition. We have an ambition of 30% reduction at 2030. We do that not only by sustainable aviation fuels. We do that by fleet renewable. I mean, we're an airline, so the thing we want to spend our money on is mostly aircraft. There's operational efficiencies, which play a role, and then the third big component is indeed a SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. We have an ambition of 10% SAF in 2030. We committed to that. Actually, the guy from Bloomberg, he just showed a graph where United is the biggest off-taker in the future. That's all nice. I think we are, at least we were in 22, and I don't know all the figures for all the airlines for 23, but at least for 22, we were the biggest off-taker, absolute, of SAF in the world. We had 17% of the total volume. We more or less doubled since last year. The market more or less doubled as well, the SAF market. So I think we're still somewhere up there, that kind of percentage.
And just tell me, how much are you actually using at the moment as a percentage? Because you want to get to 10% in 2030.
I think at KLM we're about 1.5% more or less.
Wow. I mean,
and that you say wow, but for most people that sounds like okay, that's just a little part. But if you say that's 17% of the global volume, that's suddenly really quite something to be well, at least I'm proud of. That's part of our strategy. We more or less started 2010 when we founded SkyEnergy, which was more or less a spin out of our Future Fuels department. Macquarie stepped in end of last year, which we're really happy with, to further develop this whole market. So that's more or less where we started our SAF journey. And what we're doing now, we have a strategy of both relying on our big suppliers, like the big oil companies, they will do a part of our supply. We look into the major SAF companies like the Neste, and we try to actively engage with startup companies, development companies as well. And that's where SkyEnergy is. It's a developer, so they develop SAF projects. And like them, there are a whole bunch in the world, I would say. And what we try to do there is by making small investments really early stage and combining that with offtake commitments, which they need to in the end get financing for their project. For us, that's interesting because we step in really early. We get to know a lot and learn a lot, but also make sure that we get the best deal on the fuel that gets out of that facility. And at the same time, for the project, it's incredibly important that we and our name steps in, because it also gives confidence to other investors and the big financials who actually have to put in the millions, the billions to actually build these plants, which, well, we're not into. I mean, we're just doing the first part and the offtake, and then the rest.
What do we need to know about either an enabler that's going to help you get there or something that's going to hinder you? Alexis, do you want to start?
I think one of the key enablers today is the regulation. We would never have reached in the EU this level of decarbonization of the power industry without the ETS regulation, right? Which really drove the decarbonization of power generation. We need it. We cannot afford to have a backlash against the Green Deal in all its forms: ETS, refuel aviation, refuel maritime, the Renewable Energy Directive. I know that there are a lot of elections. We just talked about the parliamentary elections in June at the European level. There is a lot of pressure from populist movements, parties against the green policy. That's a big threat. I am to be frank, more worried about the agriculture part than about the energy part, because I think thanks to the Green Deal and a lot of its adjacent policies, the train has left the station in terms of energy transition in the EU. It's unstoppable. But in agriculture, that's not true. It is just starting now. And with the riots in Europe, we might lose a good opportunity to change the way we do the agriculture and the decarbonization attached to a new type of agriculture. So that's the one thing. And I think to make sure that this transition is continued and not stopped, we also need to protect the European industry. We need the CBA, the CBAM. We need a carbon tax. We need to keep the jobs. What the Chinese do is great. They are able to build, with a fantastic planification, full industries in a matter of 3 years. They built a full biodiesel industry in 3 years, able to supply the full European Union. The EVs, everything. But we need also to make sure that we keep our industry alive in Europe. There might be some victims, like the solar panels industry, but for the rest, I think we need some kind of carbon tax to reestablish the level playing field. So I would say 2 things, the supportive legislation and the CBAM.
And we'll see the pricing starts at the end of next year, so
Yes.
it's coming soon.
Yes.
Corinne, what about you? What are your barriers, or what are the key enablers?
Well, there are a few points there. Well, I agree with what Alexis was saying on regulation, so I will just complement by saying that what we observe in terms of regulation is that many regulation in the world really provide subsidy mechanism to reduce the cost of production, and this is the case of obviously Europe, but also the IRA in the US. But Europe is really the only geography that has regulation to drive demand. And on a global level, I think that this type of regulation should be developed. And obviously, we also need stability and long-term stability in what's going on. A second point for us, it's also the availability of technology. Why? Because we started to really implement those new production, those new clean fuels. And as you go and as you convert your existing plant, you see that those new technologies are not necessarily so easy to operate, and that you face technical challenges that basically the industry has not faced before. Another example is, for example, on the hydrogen production. So coupling electrolyzers with renewable electricity is something totally new. We're already talking in the market, and we saw in the Bloomberg presentation the uptick in hydrogen investments. Basically, people are now talking about 200, 500 megawatt of electrolyzers. You need to know that the largest electrolyzer in operation today is 20. So what we're facing is really a challenge in scaling up the industry, addressing those technological challenges. Innovation will be important, and to do that in a fast pace, because time is of the essence. And we also, at the same time, need to reduce the total cost of production by at least 2 if we want those markets to be sustainable. So that needs to happen in the next 10 years. Some technologies have done that already, like wind and solar, but for hydrogen, for example, it's just the beginning.
Yeah, got a long way to go from the 10 to the 2. Jeroen, what do you see as your hindrances or helpers?
Well, I think the biggest hindrance or difficulty is more or less that if you see where production is now on SAF, that's like I said, very limited. As you see where we want to go, mandates is at 6%, 2% 2025, 6% 2030, and then 20% 2035. So that's actually going quite steep up. Our own ambition is actually higher than what the mandate is. So the mandate will probably will really help us to get supply up, but the gap between the mandate and our own ambition is still quite considerable. If you say 6% in Europe, that's more or less 4% worldwide, and our ambition is 10%. So that's more than double what the mandate is in 2030. So that's quite a challenge. And the fact is, if we want to make longer-term deals with projects. The challenge is, what is the price going to do for the next 10, 15, 20 years? And these projects are financed based on that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. How do we get stability? How do we get enough money in? I think it's a huge opportunity to make money. But which projects are going to make it? And it's not a bet per project, but it's difficult to make a good judgment on which projects are in the end, which technologies, because price will come down, probably at least cost prices, not per se market prices. That depends on demand versus supply. So I think that whole market space and how that's going to work out, that's a big challenge. I was just before talking to you on it as well, on how do you sell that to your board if you make an investment? What's going to happen?
How do you commit to something when there's so many macro factors?
Yeah, and you have to commit for 10, 15 years, and that's that's a challenge.
We like it though.
Yeah, definitely.
Elias, how about
I
you?
mean, so from our point of view, so we want to achieve this 2045 net zero target, right? So, and in order to do that, there are different levers. So first lever for us is, as for KLM, to improve our fleet efficiency, do the engine design improvements, use some paints, reduce the friction across the engine to reduce the fuel consumption. We are also working on wind propulsion-based technologies and onboard CO2 capture, all these efforts. And these type of technologies have lowest CO2 abatement cost. But then moving on, so we are now like relying a lot on biofuels consumption. And I think in container shipping, we are fortunate in the sense that we have a customer base who are willing to pay some premium. Like we have companies like Nestle and IKEA, they have their own scope 3 emission reduction targets because they have committed to SBTi targets. And that helps us then to recoup some of the premium we pay to Cargill for the biofuels. And then, then that creates some business case, right? But for the future fuels, in order to make the long-term offtake deals, we need to have, let's say, some sort of business case which we can rely upon, right? And for that, of course, there are two key, let's say, enablers. So one is the voluntary demand from the customers and their willingness to pay. And then the second is the regulatory front. And what we see now on the regulatory side, so we have EU ETS and we have FuelEU Maritime, and then we have, hopefully by 2027, a global tax from IMO. So these initiatives will definitely help us. And of course, then on the subsidy side, the Inflation Reduction Act and hydrogen production tax credit and CO2 capture tax credits, they will help then lowering the production costs of these green fuels production. So all in all, if we combine the overall picture, we think we can prepare some good business cases for green fuels investments and long-term offtakes.
Clean fuels. You've heard about the policy, the geographic issues, the political issues. If you had to make a bet in clean fuels in one product and in one jurisdiction, where would it be? Alexia, I'm going to start with you.
I will go for biogas in Europe. I know it's close to the heart of Macquarie as well. I know Tim Turney, we had a lot of discussions on that as well. You are pioneers in that. I will go for it because many biofuels are bridge fuels. Some have a short lifetime because of the electrification of the car park, because of the e-fuels coming. So electricity and e-fuels, which is in a way electricity transformed, are going to challenge some of the biofuels, right? Not biogas, because biogas is not only a biofuel. Biogas can be used for heating, industrial processes, bioplasticizers, but also biofuels, LNG, CNG, for trucks, for vessels. That's one. A lot of outlets. And it's 3 products. You produce biomethane, you produce bio-CO2, that the e-fuels industry will need at some stage, and you produce biofertilizers that the agricultural industry needs. And I like the feedstock part. We have an edge there. So yes, that's my answer.
That's a really great answer, but I'll ask Corinne what she thinks.
I'm going to answer a little bit differently. Our strategy in Total Energies is fundamentally based on the evolution of demand. What we see today is that there's still a growing demand for oil and gas up to 2030, and things are going to decrease later, and that's why we keep also investing in oil and gas in a responsible manner and reducing emissions. But for us, the second pillar of our strategy is truly based on the electrification. We're putting together an integrated power business unit right now, based on particularly our assets in renewable power, in offshore, onshore, in solar as well, because we think it's going to be one of the major trends and long-term trends in the upcoming years. Clean fuels, biofuels will take off, mostly after 2030, like we said earlier. So we're initiating this, and we are working also a lot in partnerships to initiate that and play our role there. But my bet would be on electrification.
So you love the green electron. So very quickly, for Jeroen and Elias, what would your bets be?
And in sustainable aviation fuel, obviously.
Obviously.
I would say, no, I see this as I mean, the roads towards let's say 2050, hydrogen planes are a long way out. Electrifying of aircraft is also a long way out if you want to do it at bigger aircraft. So SAF is a big part of our challenge. So we need really a lot. So I think there's also a lot of money to be made there.
Elias,
Yeah,
you get the last word.
Yeah, in our case, I think the fuel mix is very complex, right? And we need to be prepared, and we need to learn and experience all types of fuels. So that's why we are exploring all type of fuels. But if you ask to be specific to your question, I mean, if I have to invest, I would love to see the residual biomass to liquid conversion technologies becoming successful, because these are the technologies which can produce scalable drop-in biofuels at a very cost-competitive rate. So it's good for investment and good for the offtake.